Hi guys, I'm back. So at this point you should have identified satire in the previous reading, so up through chapter 7. So what I'm going to ask you to do today is in groups do a satire expert poster. So what I'd like you to do in your satire expert poster is find an example of satire, like this one, in Huck Finn that you'd like to analyze. I've printed out examples if you're not quite sure where to start, and the sub can pass those out when we're done with this video. Or you can select your own and write it on your poster paper. So once you've selected your example of satire, and it can be chapters 1 through 7, not just 6 through 7, I'd like you to define the type of satire, give a textual example from Huck Finn, which you've already identified, and then closely read and mark the chosen text. So let's give an example of what I'm looking for in that close reading. So I want you to explain how the example you've chosen is satire by, number 1, explaining what's being described that is opposite, being compared, or exaggerated from its actual representation. And 2, how does that opposite representation, comparison, or exaggeration point out a social critique? So that's a lot. Let's take a look at this example. This is an example from chapter 6, and it's Pap's racist rant. So chapter 6, page 11, I believe. Hopefully I have the right copy. So briefly read it to yourself. Okay, so hopefully you've had time to read it to yourself. If not, pause the video briefly. And let's talk through questions 1 and 2. So define the type of satire. Pap's rant can be one of two. It can be either situational irony or it can be hyperbole. This is situational irony because we know something that Huck does not know. We know that Pap is a racist. We know that he's ignorant. We know that he doesn't have any actual authority. And we know that he's repugnant. Huck, on the other hand, knows that his father's disgusting, but he's pretty typical of people of the time in terms of his attitude. So Huck reacts differently than we do because we have a better perspective of Pap's character. Huck reacts almost shrugging this rant off and just in a way where he's trying to preserve his safety. We react in disgust after reading this because it is so overtly racist, it is so overtly ignorant, it's so overtly hypocritical. I myself wanted to when I read this. And that's because we understand who Pap is differently than Huck does. It's hyperbole because it's an exaggeration of the redneck stereotype where this person is ignorant, racist, and generally loud and violent. So Pap is about as bad as that stereotype can get. So that tells us what's being compared, if you want to call it situational irony, or what's being exaggerated if you want to define it as hyperbole. So the second question asks about how does that representation point out a social critique. So Pap says some pretty vile things in his speech here. So he points out the way the man is dressed. So he had on the whitest shirt you'd ever seen, the shiniest hat, a gold watch chain, silver-headed cane. So he points these things out like they have value and that should matter when a person is voting, how they are dressed. That points out Pap's ignorance here. The way a person's dressed does not determine their ability to make a good choice when voting. But it goes on. They say he was a professor in college and could talk all kinds of languages and knowed everything. Okay, so education probably does affect how well you can make a choice for your future leaders, but Pap points it out as if it's something bad because Pap himself doesn't have an education. So he doesn't see the value in that, and he doesn't make the connection that voting is there to make the society better and to create a more equal and strong democracy. He just sees it as a right he should have and others should not, almost as if it gives him power. And then the worst is at the bottom. It was election day. That's supposed to say election. And I was just about to go and vote myself if I weren't too drunk to get there. But then they told me that he was going to vote, so I draw it out. Says I'll never vote again. So obviously Pap has never voted in general, and being too drunk to vote is not really an excuse to not vote. So the comparison between Pap and this African American man who was allowed to vote is really an exaggerated contrast. So it's a little bit of a juxtaposition, because clearly if anyone should have a right to vote over someone else, it would be this man and not Pap. But Pap sees it the other way around, that Pap should have the right to vote. Why? Because he's white and he's a man, which is not an actual reason. That's just the definition of racism. But Pap doesn't see it that way, and it points out that the South is often hypocritical at this time because it supports that racist point of view that just because you're white and you're male, you should have a right to vote. And through Pap's example, we can see how stupid that reasoning is and laugh at Pap almost, because this is such a gross exaggeration. But the critique Twain is pointing out to his male white audience is that that social norm is deeply, deeply flawed. Okay, so that's the type of thinking I'm looking for in your posters. So if I've highlighted it, on your poster, what you should do is circle it. I talked about how the social norm of allowing racism is deeply, deeply flawed. You're going to need to write that down on your piece of paper. So you might draw a line from that piece of text to your thinking on the paper that racism as a social norm is deeply flawed. So I can see what part of the text you got that idea from. So on the next slide, it gives you the explanation of what I'd like you to do in your groups. Pick a type of satire, pick a textual example, and again, see the sub when I'm done. She has different examples that you can use. And then, if you need to, you either glue that example on your poster paper in the middle, or write your own quote in the middle of your poster paper. And then highlight text that helps you answer number 1 and answer it. And then highlight text that helps you answer number 2 and answer it. So it should look like a brainstorming web by the time you're done, with your quote in the middle, text circled, lines sticking out with explanation that refers to what that text shows, either an answer to number 1 or an answer to number 2. And there should be multiple answers to both questions. Okay, thanks.